There's a pattern in history that has quietly reshaped power without armies, without invasions, and without most people ever noticing. In 64 AD, Rome reduced the silver in its coins, and prices doubled within a generation. In 1694, England created a private institution to fund endless war, and within a century its empire was owned by its creditors. In 1923, Germany printed money to survive, and by November a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Different centuries, different empires, same outcome. Each time, control shifted away from kings and parliaments and towards something far less visible: balance sheets, interest rates, debt. And right now, in 2025, the global financial system is following the exact same sequence. Trillions created, currencies diluted, sovereignty quietly transferred. And here's what should terrify you. This time, it's happening everywhere at once. This is the story of how money stopped serving nations, and nations began serving money, and how central banks quietly took control of every nation placeholder, became the most powerful force on earth. Before we go through this pattern, you need to understand what central bank control actually means. Not in textbooks, in practice. This isn't just about money. It's about who decides what survives and what collapses when a system is under stress. At first, central banks are presented as stabilizers, firefighters. Institutions designed to smooth crises, protect currencies, and prevent panic. That's the story. But over time, their role changes, quietly, almost invisibly. They stop reacting to the system and start directing it. When this shift happens, it doesn't feel dramatic. There are no coups, no declarations. Just new rules, new tools, and new dependencies. Interest rates replace laws, liquidity replaces legitimacy, and debt replaces sovereignty. It's not about conspiracy, it's about incentives. Governments want spending without consequences. Voters want growth without pain. Central banks become the mechanism that makes both possible, for a while. But here's the critical detail. Once a nation becomes dependent on monetary intervention to function, it loses the ability to stop. Printing becomes policy. Inflation becomes strategy. And control moves away from elected institutions toward unelected ones. That's not theory. That's documented history. That's what happened to Rome when silver ran out. That's what happened to Britain when debt replaced production. That's what happened to Germany when confidence collapsed. Let me show you how it happened 3 times before, step by step, and why the same mechanism is tightening again. Let's start with Rome. At its peak in the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire controlled roughly 25% of the world's population. Its roads stretched more than 400,000 kilometers. Its currency, the denarius, was trusted from Britain to Egypt. For nearly 2 centuries, that silver coin anchored trade, taxes, and military pay. But by 64 AD, the math stopped working. Emperor Nero faced rising costs from wars, reconstruction after the Great Fire of Rome, and an expanding bureaucracy. Tax revenues were no longer enough. Mining output was declining. Silver was harder to extract. So Rome chose the easiest option. It reduced the silver content of its coins from about 98% to roughly 93%. Almost no one noticed at first. By 100 AD, under Emperor Trajan, the silver content had fallen again. Around 85%. The empire was still strong, armies still marched, markets still functioned. But prices were creeping upward. Soldiers demanded higher pay. Suppliers demanded more coins for the same goods. The response was predictable: more debasement. By 155 AD, under Marcus Aurelius, military spending exploded as Rome fought wars on multiple fronts. The denarius now contained closer to 75% silver. The cause was clear. Rising expenses met limited revenue. The effect was monetary dilution. More coins chased the same amount of goods. Here's where the pattern truly begins. By 193 AD, during the year of the 5 emperors, political instability turned monetary policy into a survival tool. Emperors were buying loyalty with money they didn't have. Silver content dropped below 70%. Inflation accelerated. Trust weakened. By 235 AD, as the crisis of the 3rd century began, the denarius was barely recognizable. Under Emperor Gallienus, silver content collapsed to under 5%. Some coins contained less than 2% silver, washed with a thin coating to hide the truth. Prices exploded. A measure of wheat that cost 1 denarius in the 1st century now cost thousands. The cause and effect chain was relentless. Debasement reduced trust. Reduced trust raised prices. Higher prices forced more debasement, and every cycle made the next one worse. By 260 AD, Rome's economy fragmented. Taxes were demanded in goods because money no longer worked. Soldiers were paid in kind. Trade shrank. Cities emptied. The central authority lost control not because of invasion, but because its monetary system no longer functioned. Emperor Diocletian tried to stop it in 301 AD with the edict on maximum prices. Thousands of price controls across the empire. The result was immediate: shortages, black markets, violence. The law failed because it fought symptoms, not causes. By 312 AD, Constantine introduced a new gold coin, the solidus, restoring stability for elites and the state. But the damage was done. The middle class had been wiped out. Small producers were gone. Economic power had centralized permanently. The Western Roman Empire officially fell in 476 AD. But its monetary collapse began more than 400 years earlier, long before the barbarians, long before the sack of Rome. That's what central monetary control looks like when it replaces real productivity. Slow at first, invisible, then sudden, then irreversible. Let's jump forward more than 1,400 years. Different empire, different continent, same mechanism. By 1700, Britain was rising fast. Its navy dominated sea lanes. Its merchants controlled global trade. And at the center of this expansion sat a new institution created in 1694, almost quietly, the Bank of England. On paper, it was a solution to a short-term problem. King William III needed $1.2 million to fund a war against France. Parliament approved the creation of a private bank that would lend the money to the government at 8% interest. In return, the bank received a monopoly on issuing banknotes backed by government debt. The cause was immediate fiscal pressure. The effect was permanent monetary dependency. At first, it worked beautifully. By 1710, Britain's credit improved. By 1750, government debt stood at roughly $78 million. By 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars, it had exploded to $834 million. That number matters. It was more than 200% of Britain's annual economic output at the time. Just like Rome, Britain solved rising costs, not by producing more, but by borrowing more. And just like Rome, the consequences unfolded in stages. In 1797, faced with war costs and gold outflows, the Bank of England suspended gold convertibility. Banknotes could no longer be exchanged for gold. This was supposed to be temporary. It lasted until 1821. During that period, the money supply expanded rapidly. Prices rose, real wages fell. The working class absorbed the shock. Sound familiar? By the mid-1800s, Britain's empire was enormous, but its economy was changing in dangerous ways. Manufacturing dominance peaked around 1850, when Britain produced nearly 50% of the world's industrial goods. But debt servicing costs kept rising. Interest payments consumed a growing share of government revenue. The solution was financialization. Capital flowed into banking, insurance, and foreign lending instead of domestic industry. By 1870, Germany and the United States were outproducing Britain in steel. By 1900, Britain relied more on returns from overseas investments than from making things at home. The same trap that caught Rome was closing again. Here's the critical detail. Control had shifted. Fiscal decisions were now constrained by debt markets. War, welfare, and empire all depended on continuous borrowing. And continuous borrowing depended on the Bank of England's ability to manage interest rates and liquidity. Parliament still existed. Elections still happened. But real power increasingly sat with monetary policy. By 1914, British national debt had stabilized around $650 million. Then came World War I. By 1919, it had surged past $7.4 billion, more than a tenfold increase in 5 years. Inflation followed. The pound weakened. Living standards dropped. Britain tried to reverse course in 1925 by returning to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. The decision was pushed by the financial sector and supported by the Bank of England. The effect was devastating. British exports became uncompetitive. Unemployment soared above 10%. Coal miners' wages collapsed. The general strike of 1926 paralyzed the country. Just like Rome's price edicts, Britain's monetary correction came too late and hit the wrong people. By 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard again. The empire survived on paper, but the foundation was gone. After 1945, debt, dependency, and deindustrialization accelerated. By 1956, during the Suez Crisis, Britain discovered it could no longer act independently without U.S. financial approval. The pound was vulnerable. The Bank of England's reserves were insufficient. The empire ended not with invasion, but with a currency crisis. Different century, different continent, identical collapse. The pattern played out again. Now let's look at the most recent example. And the fastest. You probably remember this one. In 1918, Germany emerged from World War I, defeated but intact. Its factories still stood. Its workforce was educated. Its industrial base remained one of the most advanced in Europe. On paper, the country could recover, but the financial terms imposed in 1919 made that recovery almost impossible. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was required to pay 132 billion gold marks in reparations. That figure mattered. It exceeded Germany's pre-war GDP by several multiples. The cause was political punishment. The effect was a fiscal problem with no realistic solution. At first, Germany tried to pay through taxation and borrowing. By 1921, that failed. Economic output slowed. Unemployment rose. Social unrest spread. So the government turned to its central bank, the Reichsbank. Printing began cautiously. In 1919, one US dollar was worth about 4.2 German marks. By January 1922, it was 191 marks. Prices were rising, but the system still functioned. This is where the danger hides. Early inflation feels manageable. But here's what should really concern you. Once printing becomes the primary tool, it accelerates faster than political systems can react. In January 1923, France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr after Germany fell behind on payments. The German government responded by paying striking workers with newly printed money. Production collapsed. Money supply exploded. By July 1923, $1 equaled 160,000 marks. By August, it was 4.6 million. By November, it reached 4.2 trillion marks. In less than 12 months, the currency was destroyed. The collapse happened faster than anyone expected. Workers were paid twice a day so they could spend wages before prices doubled again. Life savings vanished. The middle class was erased. Pensions became worthless. Barter replaced money. Social trust evaporated. Compare the timelines. Rome's debasement took more than 300 years. Britain's debt trap unfolded over roughly 250. Germany's collapse took 4 years from strain to ruin. The pattern didn't change. The speed did. The cause and effect chain was identical. Excess obligations met limited real output. Printing filled the gap. Confidence broke. Collapse followed. In November 1923, Germany introduced the Rentenmark, backed by land and industrial assets. Stability returned almost instantly, but the damage was permanent. Political extremism surged. Democratic institutions weakened. Less than a decade later, the consequences reshaped the world. 3 times. 3 empires. 3 collapses. All following the exact same sequence. And here's what should terrify you. The United States and the global dollar system are following the exact same pattern, stage by stage, policy by policy, decision by decision, not approaching it, not warning signs. Deep inside it, stage 1 is fiscal overstretch, commitments that grow faster than real economic output. For Rome, it was legions and grain doles. For Britain, it was empire and war. For Germany, it was reparations. For the United States, it's everything at once. In 2000, total U.S. federal debt stood at $5.7 trillion. By 2010, it was $13.5 trillion. By 2020, $26.9 trillion. By December 2024, it crossed $34 trillion. That number matters. Interest alone now exceeds $1 trillion per year, more than the entire U.S. defense budget in 2001. The cause is structural spending locked in by law. The effect is permanent borrowing. Check. Stage 2 is dependency on monetary intervention. When borrowing becomes too expensive politically or economically, central banks step in. In September 2008, the Federal Reserve cut rates to near zero and began quantitative easing. The balance sheet was $900 billion before the crisis. By 2014, it was $4.5 trillion. After a brief pause, it surged again. In March 2020, the Fed created over $3 trillion in just 4 months. By 2022, the balance sheet peaked near $9 trillion. That's not stimulus, that's life support. Check. Stage 3 is currency dilution disguised as stability. Since 2020, more than 40% of all US dollars in existence were created. Consumer prices responded accordingly. Inflation officially peaked at 9.1% in June 2022, the highest since 1981. Food prices rose over 25% between 2020 and 2024. Rent rose more than 30% nationwide. Wages lagged. Savings lost purchasing power. This is the same invisible tax Rome used, the same pressure Britain shifted onto workers. Check. Stage 4 is financialization replacing productivity. By 1950, manufacturing made up over 25% of US GDP. By 2024, it's closer to 11%. Meanwhile, finance, insurance, and real estate account for more than 20%. Stock buybacks exceeded $900 billion in 2023. Corporate investment in productive capacity stagnated. The system rewards leverage over output, assets over labor, just like Britain after 1850. Check. Stage 5 is loss of monetary credibility abroad. For decades, the dollar's reserve status absorbed U.S. excesses. That buffer is thinning. In 2000, the dollar made up over 70% of global foreign exchange reserves. By 2024, it fell below 59%. Central banks bought a record 137 tons of gold in 2023. BRICS nations expanded bilateral trade outside the dollar. In 2024, Saudi Arabia signaled openness to non-dollar oil settlements. These aren't headlines, they're signals. The same kind Britain ignored before 1931. Check. Stage 6 is political capture by monetary necessity. Every modern crisis now triggers the same response. More liquidity, lower real rates, expanded deficits. In March 2023, when U.S. regional banks failed, the Federal Reserve created the Bank Term Funding Program, injecting hundreds of billions to stabilize balance sheets. Not debated, not voted on, implemented overnight. This is where control shifts completely. Policy becomes reactive to markets, not citizens. Check. Midway through this pattern, there's always a moment when denial peaks. We're different. Our system is stronger. There's no alternative. Rome said it, Britain said it, Germany said it. Here's the critical detail. We're not approaching the pattern. We're at stage 6 of 7. Stage 7 is the reckoning, the moment when monetary tools stop working as intended. What does that look like? Historically, it takes one of 3 forms: currency crisis, debt crisis, or political fracture, sometimes all 3. If inflation returns while debt servicing costs remain above 4%, interest expenses will crowd out everything else: social spending, defense, infrastructure. If rates fall again to manage debt, the dollar weakens further. Capital exits, import prices rise. Either path tightens the vice. The pattern says the next stage is forced choice. Raise rates and break the system, or print and break the currency. There is no third option. History doesn't offer one. Maybe it takes 10 years, maybe 5, maybe less. Germany didn't think it would happen in 4. Britain didn't think sterling would collapse in 1931. Rome didn't think silver content mattered until it did. This is where it becomes personal. Your currency buys less because dilution is policy. Your savings lose value because stability requires it. Your job becomes insecure because financial volatility precedes economic contraction. When this happens, credit tightens, layoffs follow, taxes rise, benefits shrink. And here's the acceleration factor. Since 2020, every stage has compressed. What took Rome centuries took Britain generations. What took Britain generations took Germany years. What's happening now is unfolding in real time. Digital money, instant liquidity, global capital flows. Speed changes everything. 3 times before, central banks expanded control to save the system. 3 times before, the system survived briefly, then failed anyway. The pattern says we're approaching the same inflection point. Check.